Got it. And there's the announcement. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to the New England Poetry Club's program of an afternoon with the New England State Poets Laureate. It's great that you're all here, and I know more people will arrive. My name's David Miller. I am the New England Poetry Club chair of programming, and I'm hosting this afternoon with Lloyd Schwartz and Lynne Viti, whom I'll introduce in a couple of minutes. This program has been in preparation for many months, and we're really excited to present this group of poets to you all. Just a couple of things before I do a little bit more in the way of details. We are now recording this, and it will be on our YouTube channel. That link, when it's ready, will be posted. Will be posted widely, so you'll be able to find that out. The YouTube channel, by the way, is available on our own website, nepoetryclub.org, and you can find our previous.
David,
Yeah.
can I ask people to mute themselves?
Yes, I was going to, and that's actually right. Most people I see are, but yes, if you could, everyone, when you're not speaking, if you could be muted, because there's just, as you've probably all experienced, there are just too many kinds of mishaps that can happen unintentionally when people are unmuted. So the way this is, what we're going to do this is I will start by introducing two of our actually municipal Massachusetts Poets Laureate. Let us note, I'm going to give you a basic fact and let it just hang in the air. Massachusetts does not have a state poet laureate. So we'll just sort of let that fact sit there. But we do have a number of municipal poets laureate. I'll introduce Lloyd Schwartz and Lynne Viti, whom I just mentioned. They will give their initial presentations, and then they will present the state poets laureate, who are alphabetically by state: Antoinette Brim-Bell from Connecticut, Julia Bouwsma from Maine, Jennifer Militello from New Hampshire, Colin Channer from Rhode Island, and Bianca Stone from Vermont. We'll hear poems from all 7 of our poets, and we've invited them all to discuss the poet laureate position, the position and the experience from their different points of view, which I'm sure are quite varied, including projects or plans they'd like to describe, or anything that seems important to share. After that's happened, and we've asked people to talk for maybe 10 minutes each, I'll come back in. We'll open up a discussion among the 7 poets laureate. I'm sure they'll have questions or comments for each other. And then, depending on the time available, we'll either have more poems from them. We might have an audience Q&A. That's not certain. We'll have to see how the time goes. So with all that, that's sort of the intro. I will introduce now both Lloyd and Lynne. Lloyd Schwartz, who is on the NEPC Board of Directors, was appointed Poet Laureate of Somerville, Massachusetts in 2019. He is the Frederick S. Troy Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and longtime arts critic for NPR's Fresh Air and Boston's public radio station WBUR. He's published 5 books of poetry and a collection of his music reviews, and has edited 3 volumes dedicated to the poetry and prose of Elizabeth Bishop. Among his honors are the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, NEA, and Academy of American Poets for his poetry. His poems have been selected for the Pushcart Prize, the Best American Poetry, and the Best of the Best American Poetry. His most recent collection is Who's on First? New and Selected Poems. Lynne Viti, who is on the New England Poetry Club Advisory Board, is the inaugural Poet Laureate of Westwood, Massachusetts, with a 2-year term running through June 2025. She was awarded the 2023 Miriam Chaikin Westbeth Artists Poetry Prize and 3rd prize in the 2023 Allen Ginsberg Poetry Contest for Westwood Lodge at the Summer Hotel. Previous awards include honorable mentions in the WOMR Joe Govea Outermost Poetry Contest, which is based in Cape Cod, the Glimmer Train 2014 Short Fiction Contest, and the 2015 Allen Ginsberg Poetry Award. The most recent of her 5 books is The Walk to Cefalù, Cornerstone Press Portage Poetry Series 2022. And with that, we'll start with Lloyd and then go to Lynne. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I love this project, and I'm really thrilled to meet the State Poets Laureate in our surrounding in the state surrounding Massachusetts. Um, and since poetry is at the center, I'm going to start with a poem, and then I'll just tell you a little bit about one of my poet laureate Somerville Poet Laureate projects. And the poem I'm gonna read is called "A True Poem." I'm working on a poem that's so true, I can't show it to anyone. I could never show it to anyone because it says exactly what I think, and what I think scares me. Sometimes it pleases me. Usually it brings misery. And this poem says exactly what I think. What I think of myself, what I think of my friends, what I think about my lover. Exactly. Parts of it might please them. Some of it might scare them. Some of it might bring misery. And I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to hurt anybody. I want everyone to love me. Still, I keep working on it. Why? Why do I keep working on it? Nobody will ever see it. Nobody will ever see it. I keep working on it, even though I can never show it to anybody. I keep working on it, even though someone might get hurt. So that's my poem. And I'll tell you about one of my projects because it's an ongoing project. It was the first thing that I started to do, and it's still going on. And it was a series called Let's Talk About a Poem, which began at the little East Somerville Public Library, which was right around the corner from my house. And the librarian, Marita Coombs, loved the idea. And once a month, I would pick a poem, and people from the neighborhood or wherever could come to the library and discuss the poem that I chose. I think my first poem was "Those Winter Sundays." Um, a really great poem, and I think maybe 6 people showed up at the library, and then the second month, maybe 7 people showed up, and then maybe 3 people showed up the month after that. And this went on for almost a year. And then COVID arrived and the library shut down. And Marita, the librarian, said, "Well, how do you feel about doing this on Zoom?" And I thought, why not? Sure. And suddenly the Zoom link was posted, and then 25 people showed up, and then 30 people showed up. We now have a Zoom list of almost 200 people. Only, somewhere between 25 and 35 people show up every month. Sometimes, if it's a poem that they're more interested, more people will show up, sometimes fewer. But people do come. Uh, and the discussions have been amazing. There are people from all over the world who are participants. I would say half the people who show up are poets, and the other half are people who kind of remembered liking poems when they were in school, but had no particular ambition in the field, but who liked to talk about them. And they're and this continues, and it's a project that I have really just loved doing. I retired from teaching shortly after I became poet laureate, and I this isn't a class, and I really want to be sure that it's that I'm not being a teacher, but it's close to teaching, and and there the how often these are poems that I thought I knew everything about, and that I always learn something from the participants, and they're part of the discussion. So I, it just, as I say, that's the one um, project uh, that um, I started as Somerville Poet Laureate, that is still continuing. Lynn?
Yeah. Thanks, Lloyd. We can go right to Lynn, I guess, but thank you.
I'm tempted to start with the stuff that I've been doing because it really connects in many ways to what Lloyd is saying. So I'll reverse my plan of order here. I began, even before I was poet laureate, I had started a Poets in the Schools program in the public schools in my town. And I funded it through a grant from the local cultural council for not a lot of money, but enough that I could pay people to come in and either do a class visit, or in the case of elementary school and middle school students, actually do mini workshops. So that was a challenge to find those people. Who I needed somebody particularly for the middle school as well as the elementary school, who were teachers and really knew about classroom management, because when you've got a group of 50 or 60 kids in front of you and you're talking about how to write a poem, you really need to know all those tricks. And I certainly couldn't do it, even though I had taught middle school for a year many years ago. So I found a couple really wonderful poet teachers, and we ran probably I think 4 programs the first year. And the other thing for me about working with the schools was, once I made a connection with the librarian in the school, if they were behind the program, I had a captive audience, which you cannot really get in a lot of poetry events in the community. I mean, and I'll talk about that briefly in a minute. So the schools, we did the workshops, we did this poetry slam. We're going to do it for the 4th year this year. Again, just small money funded by grants, bringing in judges who were poets that I meet at various open mics or no, and I prevail upon them to please come and be a judge of the poetry slam. And then I have class visits to the creative writing class in the high school. So that really touched a lot of people in the community. And that's now going on in its 3rd year. I think the other part of it is that I really relied on funding from the Cultural Council. Last year, the Youth Poet Laureate and I decided we were going to apply for a festivals grant from Mass Poetry. We got $2,500, and I said to this high school senior, "What do you want to do with this? What kind of festival do you want to have?" And she said, "I want to have a children's poetry festival." And I thought, okay. And to make a very long story short, we took the $2,500, we've got it matched by the library's 21st Century Fund. And we somehow, I guess it was just the stars were aligned, got Richard Blanco to come and be our headliner for the Children's Poetry Festival. And it drew so many children and their parents. It was K through 5, or 6 or 7. I've never seen that many people at a poetry event in my town ever. So it was very exciting. And after I did that, I felt like I should just lie down for 6 months, because it was the whole thing. There were so many moving parts. I also do teach or facilitate a poetry workshop for adults that meets every other week. And that's been going on now. We're just coming up to our 3rd anniversary. I hope to be able to do that even after the end of my term, which is supposed to end in June, but we'll see what happens. I mean, this is all very new for my town. And I think I've started doing more fun stuff now, like the Poems on Demand, where I set up a little desk in the library lobby and I plunk out, this sort of doggerel on a vintage Smith Corona manual typewriter, which the children are fascinated by, So that's another event. And the other thing that I want to do this year is to get more little poems, short poems that were written by my Tuesday evening poets into little booklets or little pieces of paper and get them out into places in the community. I stole this idea from a former Maine poet laureate, Carol Bachhoffner. So we'll see how that works, but I've been busy. And it's exhausting. It's a full-time job for me. I used to teach. This is just as busy, but it's wonderful. And I found that even people who don't like poetry and maybe remember poetry that they had in school and didn't like it, I find that you can kind of find something that they like. So I've gone to the Council on Aging. I've gone to a retirement community also in our town, and big turnout and very smart people who really want to ask questions about poetry. So it's great. Here's my poem. I don't want to use up all my time talking about my activities. Elegy written in a soccer field. Canada geese, lawn soilers, suburbia disruptors squawk over the neighborhood under gray clouds. My heart is bruised, not literally, obviously a metaphor. In my email, a notice from my high school. Another classmate has died. In her senior year photo, every hair is in place, a bouffant helmet. The photographer must have instructed her to tilt her head to the left. Soon, the number of us dead will be greater than the survivors of that post-war baby boom. A thought to mark this gray morning. As a child, I did the math. By 2000, I reckoned I'd be old, but Y2K was my midlife point, 20 years ago. So much living to come. Now the glass is looking emptier. The geese form a honking V in the sky, fly westward over the group home for disabled adults, over Temple Beth David and the preschool toward the town pond. Rest well, Linda, of the teased peroxided hair, the ready smile. Rest easy, Mary, of the sarcastic wit and the always lit cigarette. Rest in peace, Jean, with the heart broken by faithless Cuban lover. Rest Anna of the sturdy legs, acne-pitted skin. If after death you've all been born again, as we were taught in religion class, why shouldn't it be as exuberant black-necked birds, marking off the miles together, flying in formation on your way to that new life?
Okay, so now I turn the introductions over to you, beginning with Lloyd.
Oh, thank you, Lynn. And it is a pleasure to introduce Antoinette Brim-Bell. And great to meet you. Antoinette is Connecticut's 8th State Poet Laureate and the author of 3 full-length poetry collections, These Women You Gave Me, Icarus in Love, and Psalm of the Sunflower. Her poetry has appeared in Poetry Magazine and Poem a Day. That's the Academy of American Poets, poets.org, Poem a Day, among numerous other journals, textbooks, and anthologies. She has also published critical works, including The Myopic Eye in Alice Walker's Flowers and Juxtaposed Dichotomies, the idealized white suburban pastoral, the surrealist tableau of Black poverty and the women in between. She is a Cave Canem Foundation Fellow and an alum of Voices of Our Nation's Arts Foundation, VONA. A speaker, editor, educator, and consultant, she is a professor of English at Capital Community College in Hartford. Antoinette.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. This has been so much fun for me already. I really have come to believe in the necessity of poet laureates, whether they be state, national, municipal. There needs to be poet advocates for poetry, I think, everywhere. Not just for writers, but for patrons of poets, of poetry. And I've run across a lot of those. So I have been the Poet Laureate for approximately 2.5 years. My tenure ends in June, and I have had a magnificent time in this position. I've learned so much, not only about my state, but how diverse my state is. So I've been in the city, I have been out, in the farmlands, I've been on the shores. I've also been somewhere where someone said, over your shoulder, there is a revolutionary cannonball lodged in the wall. Uh, Everywhere I go, I find that the citizens of that particular city are so proud of their city and they want to show me everything. And so it's been a wonderful deep dive into Connecticut history. So I've done some projects that I'm really particularly proud of. One was my inaugural event, which was a panel and poetry reading called Poetry is Not a Luxury. We all have read that, right? Audre Lorde essay. And basically what we did, we had a wonderful panel of poets from all across the state, a very diverse panel. And we had a reading and a question and answer portion. But then everyone retired to cafe style tables, and each table discussed a different quote from the essay. And we just kind of moved and migrated around having this amazing conversation. I was very fortunate also to be asked by the New England Ballet if I would be interested in having my third book, These Women You Gave Me, turned into a ballet. And I thought, oh my God, that is so amazing. And so they commissioned choreographer Sarah Grace from New York, and she did a wonderful choreographed ballet called In Her Image. And it was danced in West Hartford, Connecticut, but also on the Alvin Ailey stage in New York. And yeah, I cried through both performances. It was so amazing to see my brainchild live in another form and be interpreted by other people. So that was quite amazing. I also partnered with the Windsor Historical Society, and did a day of poetry into history. And so the first part of the day was for students, K through like, I guess it was 5th grade. And they received a poetry lesson and also had a tour of one of the properties that the Windsor Historical Society keeps open for the public. And then they came back and wrote poetry. We had lunch, and then the next part of the day was about how to teach or how to incorporate poetry into um, your class despite the discipline. And so that was a lot of fun. As I said, I am in the last 6 months, and right now I'm working on my final project, which is a poet laureate anthology from the municipal poets in Connecticut. And we're very fortunate to have many municipal poets, municipal poet laureates, and we're hoping to have even more. We have a wonderful council of poet laureates that keeps us together, keeps us connected, and supports, the efforts of individual poet laureates and the collective as a whole as we participate in things together. Uh, One of the things I've learned during my tenure is just how diverse poetic perspective and performance can be. I've attended, my first slam poetry. I've always been a page poet and enjoyed how exciting and participatory it is, and the yelling and the screaming and cheering for the people that you like the best. Boy, that was so much fun. I've also attended symphony plus poetry plus ballet, where all of these things have come together in New Haven with the New Haven Poet Laureate, a local ballet studio, and the New Haven Symphony. And we've also done quite a few ekphrastic exercises where Connecticut artists have worked with Connecticut poets, and their work has been presented side by side, which leads me to my poem. I found a beautiful uh, impressionistic uh, painting of the 8 Mile River, and it just spoke to me. So I decided that I would choose that to write a poem about. The poem begins with an epigraph from the poet Gary Young. It's a joy to be subtracted from the world. 8 Mile River needs no audience. It shushes creation, claps hard against the rocks. It is its own call and response. Let the sun-soaked stones skip across this canvas where amethyst lay with emerald, and colorways become thoroughfares where blues enter into rivulets of jazz. Confluence. The painter's brush meets the light. This torrential river has polished into shards atop mosaic-petaled sprays, chromed into infinity. We are voyeurs, an unwelcomed convergence of wonder and worry. Leave the river to sleep in its deep shadows, where brushstrokes turn touchstones, while water-soaked air smudges graphite into an open palm that holds up the whole 8 Mile River. Thank you.
Okay, Lynn.
Okay. Our next poet is Julia Bouwsma from Maine. Born in New Haven and educated at Swarthmore College and the Goddard MFA program, Julia is Maine's 6th Poet Laureate for a 5-year term ending in 2026. She lives off the grid in Western Maine. She's a farmer, a homesteader, editor, teacher, small town librarian, serving as director of the Webster Library in Kingston, Maine. She also teaches at the University of Maine, Farmington. Julia is the author of 3 poetry collections, the forthcoming Death Fluorescence from Sundress, Midden from Fordham University Press 2018, and Work by Bloodlight, Cider Press Review 2017. Her other honors include 2 Maine Literary Awards, a 2024 Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship, the Poets Out Loud Prize 2016-2017, Cider Press Review Book Award in 2015, and residency fellowships from Virginia Center for Creative Arts, Vermont Studio Center, Monson Arts, and Annex Arts. So take it away, Julia.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And it feels very organic to be following Antoinette because I did grow up in New Haven. But Maine has been my home for the last 20 years now. I moved here when I was 25, and I would say that I very much become the poet that I am in Maine. And my poetry is very much shaped by Maine. One of the things that's interesting and exciting for me about being a poet laureate of my state is that I get to discover so much more about my state than I already knew. But I also have the honor of representing my state to other people, and I think that Maine is a state that is not always well understood to the outside eye. Because I think that there's this image of Maine that is, as a tourist state, I think there are some people who are sold the idea that the state is made entirely of coastline. And we are in fact a very large rural state. I live in the western mountains of Maine. I'm 2.5 hours from Portland. I'm 2 or 3 hours from the coast, depending at what point. I could travel 6 hours to get to northern Maine. So it's a huge state. It's a state with a lot of, the geography can be isolating. It's a state with a lot of cultural and political polarities. It's a state where a lot of the resources for poets and writers reside, and honestly for everything, reside in the southern and coastal parts of the state that are more populated. So I will say that as poet laureate, a focus for me has been on thinking about poetry in terms of rural equity, and also thinking about poetry as a means for communication and listening and connectivity, because we have a huge range of experiences within Maine. And there's a lot of tension. There are people who have never traveled out of their county, let alone the state, and there's a lot of income inequality. And then we have, a wonderful growing population of new Mainers and asylum seekers. And so there's so many exciting voices. But to try to help people connect through poetry is a big part of my focus. So that's meant a couple things for me. One thing it's meant is that I spend a lot of time in my car. I put on a lot of miles, and I try to do a lot of things in person now that we've returned to that. So I was looking, I accidentally did the math. I probably shouldn't have the other day, but in the last, from November 21st to through December 3rd, I put on over 700 miles for Poet Laureate related events. And I visited the Maine State Prison, an assisted living facility, a school, and a public library in that time. So I try to just, a lot of that is just going places and being there and sharing poetry, supporting poets, and having those conversations. In terms of projects, the one I want to talk the most about is the Write Me Epistolary Poetry Project. So I did this as a pilot project in 2023 with a little bit of funding from the Maine Arts Commission. And then I was my Poet Laureate Fellowship from the Academy of American Poets is a larger version of this project. So the first version was a pilot, little mini, and what it is essentially it's a 3-phase project. The first phase is to introduce the idea of epistolary poetry. Because for many people, I wanted this to be something for poets and the poetry curious alike. And so the phrase is a bit intimidating. But of course, then people find out it's a poem that's a letter, and you've already written a letter and you know how. So it's really an accessible form. And I'm so drawn to the ritual and urgent. So I have so what we did is we did workshops all over the state. There were 5 in the pilot program, but in the full version of the project for my Academy of American Poets Fellowship, there were 20 plus in-person workshops and a couple of online workshops, including one with Richard Blanco. And each of these workshops was taught by a different Maine poet. So this was also a way of supporting poets all over the state. And so that was just to introduce the concept. Then people were invited to sign up for a poetry pen pal for the winter. So we just sent out assignments the other week for poetry pen pals, and I think we have almost 250 people participating in this. So they will be exchanging with their poetry pen pal from December through March. And then in the spring, we'll be doing a number of different events to celebrate that, both virtual and in person, in multiple medias. So I'm really excited about that. And that was something that I had dreamed about from the beginning, but it's definitely had a lot of moving parts and been very logistically complicated. So I'm really excited that we're through the first phase going into the second, and it's a lot of fun for me. I also participate in a couple of other projects. I mean, I feel like there's many things, right? But very quickly, because I didn't look at the time, and I should have when I started. I'm so sorry. So very quickly, I will say I participate in a radio program for Maine Public called Poems from Here. This is a project that was started by my predecessor, Stuart Kestenbaum, and he reads poems by Maine poets on the radio. It's a little segment that they do for 5 minutes every weekend. We expanded it. For me, I'm one judge, but I wanted to have a broader range of voices. So I'm one of 5, I'm sorry, not judge, hosts. So I'm one of 5 hosts. So we have a variety of different voices doing that. I also do a lot of work with the Poetry Out Loud program in our state. And that's really exciting to me. And, you know, I think those are, yeah, I'm just looking at my notes here. I won't bore you with too many details. I think those are the biggest things that I want to talk about. But really just the joy of finding out what people have already been doing and getting to discover that in such a big state, because I think Maine is a state where with lots of amazing ideas, but sometimes we're all doing them in our own little vacuum. So I've spent a lot of time just trying to learn and connect and listen and see how we can collaborate on different things. Oh, I did think of one more thing I will say very briefly. which is that I was asked to write a libretto for a mini opera that will be out next fall. And this is a collaboration with the Halcyon Quartet and a composer in Rockland, Maine. And it'll be focused on the idea of the future and climate change. So I'm really excited about that as well. And that's a pretty good segue for the poem I'm going to end with, because this is a poem that I was asked to write. This is the first public poem I had to write as poet laureate. I was very scared of the idea of a public poem, but I was asked to write a poem for the Maine's bicentennial time capsule. So this was to be opened 100 years after I wrote it. So I wrote it as an epistolary poem. This is to a Mainer living 100 years from now. The other day I stood beneath an ash tree, as old as the time between my writing this letter and you reading it. Inside the green moment of the forest, I traced my finger across the ash's trunk. Grooved bark staggered like vertebrae. A deer bent back to listen, quiet flanks reddening the stillness before crouch became bolt, and it leapt into a lattice of blackberry cane and brush. Tell me, unknown friend, what has dissipated from our home and what remains? Does it still snow hard enough to swallow your footsteps in light? Do you drink sap each spring, boil your sorrow into new waft and gold? We lived here at the edge of the old rituals, lived there until we could not discern our hope from our fear. Wildfire smoke smeared a low brow of bruise, a language written in billowing keloids and contrails, vanishing welts of vapor. Are you still repeating our same old violences, or have you learned new ones? Can you wring a chicken's neck with your hands, twist and pull the throat in unison, as my grandmother's grandmother did, and I do now? Or have you colonized Mars, erected skyscrapers of cosmic concrete? Scientists are at it now, discovering a building material of human tears, sweat, urine, blood. It hardens fast and cheap, stronger, they say, than anything we've ever known before. For you, I wish nothing but birdsong. I wish you a pond of peepers screaming spring thaw, and all those apple trees I planted. It's early autumn now, their striated skins seeping blush into white flesh as they ripen. Do they still stand on this hill? Pick one for me, please, if they do. Bite down among stippled wormholes and taste our blinding sweetness. Thank you.
Oh, bravo. I am now very happy to introduce Jennifer Militello, who is the Poet Laureate of New Hampshire. She's the author of the forthcoming hybrid collection, Identifying the Pathogen, as well as The Pact, which came out in 2021, and the memoir, Knock Wood, winner of the, am I saying it right, the Zonk Nonfiction Prize?
Zank, yeah.
Zank. In 2019, as well as 4 previous collections of poetry, A Camouflage of Specimens and Garments from 2019, Body Thesaurus, 2013, Flinch of Song, and the chapbook, Anchor Chain Open Sail. Her work has appeared in Best American Poetry, Best New Poets, American Poetry Review, The Nation, The New Republic, The Paris Review, Poetry, and Tin House. She teaches in the MFA program at New England College. Jennifer Militello.
Thanks so much, Lloyd, and thank you to you, David and Lynn, for organizing today. It's really just wonderful to be gathered here with my fellow laureates to be able to talk about our experience. I am a fairly new laureate, so I just started in April of this year. And I really, started out thinking about this role as not only a kind of visibility role to increase the visibility and the vitality of poetry in the state, but also as a role that might increase access, but also cultivate passion, right? So kind of thinking about all of those different aspects of the poetry experience for different audiences. For those who are really familiar with poetry, who really already love poetry, to kind of be representing poets in the state, but also to make myself available to those who have never met a poet before, or who have really been less aware of the contemporary poetry community and the fact that poems are being written right now all the time. So I've kind of been thinking about that sort of broader sphere of poetry. And so really my goal at the beginning, as I've sort of started out, is to say yes to everything and to just make myself really available. One of the first things I did was I reached out to high school and middle school teachers of English in the state and said, I'm here. I know you're exhausted. I know your curriculum is probably really set and pretty rigid, but please let me know how I can support you and how I can help you bring poetry to your students. So I've been visiting a lot of schools, which has been really exciting. Students sort of see you as like a rock star of poetry for some reason. They're like, wow, there's a real poet here. So that's been really, really fun. And then just so many other amazing things. I've been visiting libraries. I've been judging contests. I've been judging poetry slams with Slam Free or Die in New Hampshire. I will be talking about poems on New Hampshire Public Radio as we celebrate the end of 2024. So people have been invited to send poems in, and then I will choose a few and chat about those. I've been involved with Poetry Out Loud. So it's just really been an incredibly busy and incredibly exciting time. And one of the things I've realized is that poetry is alive and well. People love poetry. People want to read poems. People want to talk about poetry. There's this sense that poetry is dying, right? We hear all of those, those articles that would come out like every, couple of years, poetry is dead. Poetry is not dead. People want to think about poems. People want to hear about poems. The other thing that I have been centering on, pre-pandemic, I used to organize the New Hampshire Poetry Festival, which was a day for poets across the state to get together. And then recently, the New Hampshire Book Festival had its first festival in October. So what I'd like to do is to add more of we had, this year we had a really great little poetry offering. Paul Muldoon was there because his partner was there as a headliner. And then we had one panel that was How Can We Hope, which kind of examined how poems can offer reassurance and kind of challenge the difficulties of our age. So that was really wonderful, but I would like to sort of expand the offerings at this festival so that poetry is really well represented. And I would like to also, hopefully around the time of the festival, have some poems mounted in windows in Concord, New Hampshire, so that people can walk around the capital city and sort of see poems embodied there in their spaces. New Hampshire is a really interesting place because it has a really rich poetic history. And there are so many poets who are from New Hampshire. And as a kind of baby poet, I always dreamed of living here and sort of being part of that history. But I think, as others here have said, there's that rural and urban sort of mix of people. So you're really thinking about the kind of diversity of that experience. And New Hampshire, you're kind of traveling to these different spaces where things are very different. And I've seen this even just in the high school experience, right? There are high school students who are so far away from this kind of literary experience. And then there are some who are very immersed in it. So it's been really exciting to think about the ways that I can support especially young people, because I remember being a really young poet and being uncertain, and feeling like I was the only sort of strange poetry person in the world. So just saying to those students, there are poets. You can be a poet. Poetry is a great thing. And in that way, thinking about inclusion, right? Saying to everyone, poetry is about you. It's about your strongest feelings. It's about your toughest moments. Academia is a shelter for poetry, but it's not its home, right? Its home is your home. Its home is within your experience and within your reality. So all of that also has been really important to me. And being the first kind of post-pandemic laureate, I'm also just thinking about the fact that people are gathering again. This has been really exciting. There's been this kind of renewed energy around gatherings. So just being part of that community as well, in that way. And so, that's the basic gist. So I will just read my poem. The poem I'd like to read is a technology poem, because I think we are in an age where we're really facing the danger of incorporated, planned cultural distraction. I think we really need to be careful of that. And I think it's important for poems to continue to challenge the status quo, and to really ask us to think about the things that we accept without thinking about them. So this is Antisocial Media. It's easier to computer than to crash. It's easier to computer than to hold a hand or knit a winter together from headlights on the highway. It's easier to computer and be a hybrid and cross from bowels and eardrums into hours lit and roaring by like freight. The chapters there can tell you an octopus has 3 hearts, that snails breathe through their feet. It is easier to have no arms or breath, to position through colors and jumps shoreless as steam. No surfaces, no verbs to be. No muscles or bellows or congestion or caffeine. No lens to focus, no Rome to burn. Who can do when the roots are so untidy and the branches rack like antlers against other branches? It's easier to computer than to guess at a savior, than to whisper slips of information to the flesh. Let language construct mere dewdrops of light. Let the circuitry gauge the need and make it clean and make it so heady it is erected a remedy in its ease. There is no destination, no grave in place of a person loved in the past, no identity classified, factual, no glass to break open in the fisted hand, no cracked windshield, no hurricane. Or there is, but it is closed inside its box, smaller than the box for roses, dead and moldered by the time they reach the door, delivered only once. Thank you.
Oh, Lynn, you're muted if you're speaking.
Our next poet is Colin Channer, who was born in Jamaica, educated there, as well as in New York. Colin's 10 books include fiction, poet, and editor. And his most recent collection is Console, a finalist for a 2023 New England Book Award. Recent honors include a 2023 Barnes & Noble Writers for Writers Award from Poets and Writers magazine, a 2022 Cullman Fellowship from the New York Public Library, a 2019 Amy Clampett Residency, and a 2018 Henry Merritt Riston Fellowship from Brown University, where he is an associate professor in the Department of Literary Arts. Previous honors include a 2015 Fellowship in Fiction and a 2014 Fellowship in Poetry from the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, and a 2010 Musgrave Medal in Literature, one of the oldest awards in the Western Hemisphere. Colin is a co-founder of the not-for-profit Calabash International Literary Festival Trust and served as the organization's artistic director and board chairman from 2001 to 2012, guiding it from inception to maturity as a leading presenter of writing workshops, literary performances, publishing seminars, and film screenings, all at no cost to the public. He is one busy person. So I'm delighted to introduce the Poet Laureate of Rhode Island, the smallest state in the Union, Colin Channer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm sitting here going, how did my tiny 3-line bio become that voluminous thing? Wow, thank you so much. Thank you very much. So yes, I'm from Jamaica, and I live in Rhode Island, and it's really funny because Rhode Island is literally half the size of Jamaica. So who migrates from a bigger, small place to a smaller, small place? I mean, it's completely ridiculous. I think I'll read first, right? And chat a little bit. I'm going to read a poem by the name of Console. No, Spumante is the name. And the only thing you need to know is that there's a reference to the Berkshires, and it's because Herman Melville lived in the Berkshires, right? And that may be the only thing you need to know. So here we go. Spumante. Weeks diffuse into each other like they're sprayed. Jetted, they shoot certain. Days, times, doodles, kept appointments. Next is lull, pool, fading, flash, disperse. I was shook and shocked by death. Chanced upon it on a winter walk. Proof of plod for miles behind me swept in fog. A wet so thick it blended with the snow that settled plenty on the sand. It was not yet daybreak, and I'd driven miles to walk and think, find peace in sweat and sea racket, that ancient, wise, asthmatic sound. The light took its lazy time for lifting. In the shift, I saw a darker shaping than the gray. At 2 miles, a boat of some proportion. At a 1/4 mile, a whale. Since then, I've been lamenting, moving as if held in gel. At night, I dream it, see it stretched across the rack of high tide, belly to the stars, flung shells and gravel, throat part grooved, fins unflappable, balletic fluke symmetric in their pointing, how they fused. All this in half light. All this in sea dirge, wet air matte toned silver. And I hunched in the hood of my parka, God-awed before Shavasana, stilled as if the glassy eye that looked to me had fixed me in a century of tintype. Agape. I've only recently discovered love of animals, well, Killy, Nan, and Rebus, friends' dogs. Now I've partly taken leave of language, have given incoherence due. I know what it's like to be mammal, filled with deepest ocean sounds, oblivion, solitude, stillness intermitted by quake roar, tectonic slipping, lava fissures, ship propellers drilling, the human croons of whales. There is slave in me, fat heritage. No fluke, I'm invested with hurt. Echo of the hunted, located, natural rights redacted, meagered to resource. All is flux as I'm collapsing love and distance, moving through the gel, my life, edging the canals of my city, clumping up its hills, memory aerosol, head in self-cloud, getting Melville as I should have, watching at him contemplate the vista from a landlocked house, hills becoming pods of transmigrating giants, Greylock, Berkshire Range. There's thirst for music in this less than solid state. Ampless, back in my office, I knee prop my Fender, ancient, black thing, strum it, casual, weep. Suck salt in darkness, fingers guessy, lazing of the sound, still something brusque runs up me. Shuddered wood, that deep flesh shook that makes string music fuse to you. The thumbing further breaks the thing in me. I know what now love is. No tentative for sure, its incoherence, jelly analog, is mine for life. The windows stay black and phlegmatic as the air outside begins to heave with rain. I hum, thumbing, fashion something of a home, some sucker. Pulse quick but steady as I deep dive to dub. With it comes the baleen wheeze of mouth organs, plangent blue whoop. I am dub, and dub is water. Exile, I wish you could have lived in me. Plunging, life spumanti. I'd slip my hold on you like magma shot for islands every single time you breach. And that's a poem. Thank you. So, I only became state poet, I think, in March of this year. And in thinking about the position, I think the most important duty of a state poet is to continue making the poems that justify the appointment in the first place. Because it's a position of honor, right? And I know sometimes it can be sort of misconstrued as a kind of unpaid state clerical position, right? But fundamentally, it is an honor. The first state poet of Rhode Island was Michael Harper. Next was C.D. Wright, Tom Chandler, Lisa Starr, Rick Benjamin, then most recently Tina Kane. And I've always been somebody who's been publicly engaged. Most of my friends are not poets. Most of my friends are not even writers. I live a very ordinary life while teaching at a university. My vision there are a couple of things that I would love to see in Rhode Island. One of them is that we should have an international literary festival. Rhode Island's a very international state. It's a state of immigrants, and continues to revivify itself with new waves of migration. I would love to see that. But that's not something that a state poet can do more than encourage. What gives me a lot of confidence that this is possible is the many layers of artistic involvement in the state, especially the literary. There's a wonderful organization here, Lit Arts Rhode Island, and they do a lot of workshops. They have writing spaces, entities like that. The colleges with their programs, and also just the many writers that the state has produced. So it's great being, I did my first reading as state poet. A second grader by the name of Annalise May Scott invited me to Vartan Gregorian Elementary School because I'm her friend. And she told her teacher that my friend is a state poet and he will come if we ask him. And she asked, and I went to Poetry Week, and it was amazing, right? And it's one of those, it's, doing that kind of engagement, especially with small children, actually quite beneficial to me. Why? Because they use language in surprising ways because they haven't been fully acclimatized to what should we do. And so when I'm among small children and hearing them use language, I go, that's actually stealable, and I feel guilty, being, stealing from small children. But that's something, as poets, I think, part of our wiring as poets is to have an ear for the expression and the observation that is not standardized. So yeah, so that's me. I'm quite happy to be state poet. I think it's a big honor, and I can think of many people in the state who could easily have been chosen. I feel fortunate, but as my mother has always said, I was born lucky, and so it happened to be me. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you. What a wonderful group of readers, of poets and readers you are. And now I am very happy to introduce the last of our New England State Laureates. Bianca Stone is the Poet Laureate of Vermont. She's the author of the poetry collections Someone Else's Wedding Vows from Octopus Books and Tin House 2014, The Mobius Strip Club of Grief, Tin House 2018, and What is Otherwise Infinite, also Tin House 2022. She's the winner, which was the winner of the 2022 Vermont Book Award. And she's part of a collaboration with Anne Carson on the illuminated version of Antigonic, Anne Carson's revisionist translation of Sophocles' Antigone that came out with New Directions in 2012. Bianca's work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Poets and Writers, The Nation, and elsewhere. She co-founded the poetry-based nonprofit Ruth Stone House, where she teaches classes on poetry and poetic study, hosts the Ode and Psyche podcast, and is editor-at-large for Itinerant magazine. Bianca, welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Um, I'm gonna start with this poem called "What's Poetry Like?" Poets play the winter tarantella, making love in the midnight hours on a white iron bed like a dog's skeleton, distinguishing the essential and unessential moment shared between ordinary lunatics, and screaming over a bird and an apple tree until an elegy has to be written to resuscitate the relation. Those who look towards the depleted wildlife of neighborhoods with tragic relish to see somehow ourselves disappearing about ourselves. Once in New York City years ago, the internet technician finally arrived. His teenage apprentice stood in my living room over a Transtromer book. He said it looked kind of cool, and he wanted to know what it was. Poetry, I said. What's poetry like? He asked. And the treacherous inadequacy with which one finds oneself, explaining in a few loose, deficient words something with lungs and no face, the immortal freak of language you haunt and hunt, which is the original state of language you're trying to get back to from within. Poetry, whose rare geniuses come as bittersweet, suicidal explosions on the tongue, randomly felt during long, tedious meals, award-winning and already forgotten, all the emoting of the unanalyzable fragments, all the surrender and detonations of precision and reckless insight, and references to hidden wisdom in Coke cans, conversations across time, and slips into truth and obscurity of thought, altogether blissfully the form itself at its best, strings of dreams in the waking life, overlaid like unobserved clothing, the words that sing stillness, the silence craved by perpetual auctioneers, that which is not the tale of an event, but itself an event. You know what? Just take the book, I said finally, pushing it into his hands. Thanks, he said, and took it away, grinning a little. But later, with snow in my head and a thunder in my right eyelid, I was worried, as I was so dangerously then, about dark yet unspoken things that frightened me. That shiny black and white book, wafting around New York City in the back of a Time Warner cable van, waiting to be opened, waiting to torment him, thinking of it changing his life. I had to turn my computer off. Right. I was thinking that being Poet Laureate of Vermont really recently, actually, one thing that has been a project of mine is learning how to spell laureate the first time I try correctly. And I'm not there yet, but I've got 3 more years to work on it. And also just like keep doing what I'm doing. I mean, I think I have to echo Colin a little bit here because I've gotten asked almost an absurd amount of times, like, what does it mean to be Poet Laureate of Vermont? And I'm like, well, it's an honorary position for being a poet, and contributing poetry to the world and being in a state, you know? And one thing it highlights too is like my state's respect for poetry. And like we started with Robert Frost and worked our way out from there. So I feel like super honored to be part of a history of poets who lived in this landscape. Of course, we've all mentioned like the state itself as being something obviously important here. But that being said, like I had like moved back to Vermont where I grew up, from New York City because I inherited my grandmother, the poet Ruth Stone's house, to be used for the furthering of poetry and the arts, just very generally. It's falling into the ground. There wasn't any money. So I had this beautiful coterie of friends and poets and colleagues and mentors behind me, and been cobbling together this little kingdom in the mountains that's completely devoted to poetry. And I live and breathe every day, like respecting and promoting poetry just by like living as a poet, right? So I love to continue just doing that work. We have classes, we have like a letterpress workshops, we have a letterpress space where we make poetry on the letterpress machine. And we have free events for people to come share their poems on the porch at Ruth's house and print on the letterpress machine and have drinks. And I think my main goal as poet is to actually talk about poetry in semi-formal and informal settings, right? So like at the Ruth Stone House. But I kept thinking, okay, well, what is my project? Because I know the Vermont Arts Council, who I love so much. Oh, that's the other thing I wanted to say. So the way I was chosen as Vermont Poet Laureate is really beautiful and democratic, and like the people who chose me were like the previous poet laureates. Mary Ruffo was the one before me who I adore, and then various poetry organizations in Vermont. And like, wow, it really speaks to that how like people were like, were you surprised? And I'm like, well, of course I'm like completely honored and surprised in that way. But I also like, part of me was like, well, I've been working so much with other poets in the state, just like doing poetry things. So we all are on the same page together, and like we have this little community. And even though we're all like, I'm like in my closet right now writing poetry, but I don't know, it just speaks to like this, our state, and like how much we love poetry and want to support one another, right? So right. So when they asked me what my project was going to be, and I said, the only thing I can think of that I really want to do is kind of honing what I've already been doing, which is giving lectures on poetry that are free to the community and talking about poetry and reading poetry to people, right? So reading good poetry to people and doing a good job at it has a massive effect. And that's something I've learned, just growing up with poetry and practicing it. So I want to get people like coming together in small towns in town halls or something, and give like a lecture on poetry and read poetry during the lecture, and then open it up to Q&A. And having those like one-on-one discussions about poetry and opening people up to what poetry is, because I feel like there's so much misunderstanding about it. And to me, I'm sorry, just the final thing I'll say is like, to me, like it's actually, it is a more challenging, like I'm not afraid to challenge people when talking about poetry, like bringing theory into the discussion, bringing poetry from across the ages, not just contemporary poetry, talking about philosophy, talking about psychoanalysis, talking about how science is incorporated, talking about consciousness itself in poetry. What I've found is rather than scaring people away, like people are very hungry for it, very willing to have difficult conversations about what poetry can do, and like really moved by it. And I feel like that's all I can do. And I do plan to like sort of formalize the lectures and call it the State of Poetry, and give about 4 a year is I think what I can manage. And do it in different parts of the state. And I just really look forward to doing that. And then I think the poetry I'd talk about is probably Vermont poets, and sort of bouncing off of their poetry to open the discussion around poetry in general and consciousness. So I'm so looking forward to that. This is what we're doing right now, I think. The end.
Thank you, Bianca and everyone. We're getting close to 4:30, but I don't really want us to just go away so quickly. So I think we have a few minutes. I would, if there are questions that any of the seven of you who have spoken have for each other, or comments for each other, I think that would be a good way to use our remaining time, probably the best way to use our remaining time. So that's just sort of wide open. So unmute when you're ready, and if you have questions or, you know, reflections or whatever.
Well, you all make me wish even harder that Massachusetts had a state poet laureate, because to do something that really involves, I mean, Julia, those 700 miles, I envy that. You know, Somerville is one of the most densely populated little cities in the country. I don't have to travel very much uh, to get around, but the idea of the diversity of rural and urban in all of these states, in all of the New England states, I think that's just great, and I loved what you had to say, and I envy you.
It's so ridiculous that Massachusetts doesn't. I was just teaching at UMass last semester and like staying with my mentor, the poet Darrell Wire, and like we kept talking about it. Like it's just so insane. There's so many great poets in Massachusetts. It's got such an old history in the United States. It's weird.
Well, and I think what it's going to take is every single other state poet laureate and every other poet in Massachusetts or in, you know, a stone's throw of Massachusetts, we will have to go to the state house and sit in and say, we're not leaving until you get this out of committee, because it just gets stalled. It's so frustrating.
Why is it a funding thing? Probably.
No,
If they give you any
a
money.
funny thing, but we're not talking big bucks here.
Yeah.
I think it's not important thing. Yeah, hold a slam, and I think we should sit in. I really do. Of course, you know, 1960s type person. I don't know how else we get them to move their butts and move that bill. How many times has it stalled? It's just perennially there, and it just never goes anywhere.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's something we could work on, Lloyd.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
It is embarrassing.
There is a little bit of a groundswell of publicity that's starting again, and hope it goes somewhere. I think it just requires I mean, the former co-president of the New England Poetry Club was a state representative for many years, and even she couldn't
No.
get it moved. But I
Maybe she
think
could spearhead our project.
there has to be, we have to really embarrass the state legislature, but that may be beyond even poets to do. I would love to hear more poems.
I was wondering, I saw something that Jennifer Phillips posted in the chat that I was hoping to respond to briefly, if that's okay.
Oh,
Yes,
sure.
do, please.
Jennifer writes, as a poet writing out of solitude, I am delighted by this experience of community and snapshot of poetry and its leadership in the wider world. I wanted to respond to that because I am very much a poet who is writing out of solitude myself. I live off the grid in rural Western Maine on 86 acres in the middle of the woods. And really until the last 5 years or so, without a whole lot of connection to the poetry community in Maine. So it was a very abrupt switch from me. I spent a long time working on my first two books, and then they came into the world very quickly on the heels of one another. And then I started to develop much more of a relationship within the poetry community in the state. But it happened very suddenly to me. For me, and I'm someone who thinks a lot about the idea of writing poetry in isolation and then how to move into community, because that was a really interesting challenge and experience for me. And also because many of my poems, until serving in this role, were very private, very personal poems. So I tend to think a lot about, there was a quote in a letter that Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote to her mother, saying that, I'm paraphrasing, but any poet who publishes a book is willingly appearing on stage with her trousers down. And, I think there's this aspect of poetry for me that is about radical vulnerability. So thinking about that and solitude and that connection, that relationship between solitude and what does community and maybe even leadership look like is a really interesting thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's an old tension in poetry between the sort of public and the city, and like even like Plato was, like he wanted to kick the poets out. He said they had no place in the politic, because they, various reasons, including inciting madness. And but the conversation around the public and the private in poetry is like, that alone is like such an asset to engaging with poetry, because you start to question and examine and look at what it means to the interior and the exterior, the public and the private. And like, I think you're exactly right, Julia. Like, there's this, like, you kind of can't believe that you're putting the most complex parts of your unconscious and your private world on the page, but like that moment of making it public, like, right, it's not you anymore, right? It's something for the other. And that like intimacy that happens with listening to poetry and reading poetry, where you feel seen, paradoxically, your private world seen by seeing somebody else's, putting it out there. But I love that paradox of poetry, that like we all write poetry in private, as generally, unless it's more like experimental, but by writing something like the epistolary form is such a good form to talk about, right? Because what is a letter? It's like a mediation between people, and that's the poems a form of media, a form of mediation, and message in a bottle.
Well, and I think that's why the visibility piece is so important, right? I think for people who are finding poems in their private spaces, and aren't, especially who are young and aren't quite sure where they can take this or what they can do with it. They just know they are reading work and responding to it and then creating their own work. I feel like seeing poets existing in the world is, there are people who are doing this, who are feeling this as well, who are quietly, sitting at their desks making work too.
It's so true. Like, I love what you said about like just showing people like what a poet looks like, which is like, that is a large part of it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
Poet isn't some abstract like person in a book that's boring or something, or like silly. It's like a real person with lots of different kinds of people.
So
There used to be, sorry, but it just makes me think too that there was a time before the written word where you had to be present for your poems to be there, so that embodiment of poetry is really fun to talk about too, as like the body used to have to be present.
Yeah, but the question of the body being present is something which is also contemporary, because where I come from, for example, the idea of one can't take being published for granted as a thing. So, most poets in places like Jamaica, they have to be there for the poem to be heard. This is a very luxurious conversation we're in America, to have these things, because most of the world lives very differently when it comes to material culture, but also to, professional involvement in the arts. So one of the things that animates me is that I think that these positions are important, but anybody who is a state poet was prior to their appointment an active poet. Good. So we're all writing, we're all engaging. So then these appointments come. And one of the things I think Massachusetts should think about is that, you know, if and when there is an official state poet of Massachusetts, it doesn't become just a freelance position without appropriate support from the institutions and bodies that make these appointments, because sometimes poets can be left to do a lot of work on their own without support, right? So I think that in thinking this through, that question of support is really important. I'm really glad that the Academy of American Poets has this fellowship that can give state poets support to do work on the ground in their states, but also to continue their careers. You know, some state poet positions, for example, do not come with a small budget for that state poet to put things into action. So really then, so there are these kind of quasi-freelance, there's a kind of quasi-freelance aspect that can creep into these things, right? And again, if it's an honor, treat it like an honor.
I know, and like, would it be like so radical also to just support poets being poets? I mean,
Right.
I remember like I went to this Vermont Arts Council like get together with like all, you know, like creative arts sector, and everybody was like talking about how to support the arts more and giving proposals and like having little groups about it. And I noticed that like everything was about like making something for the public, like in a public space and stuff, which is great. But I also was thinking like, what about artists like in those private spaces who want to make art too, that's like public in a different way? And different ways to talk about what it means to make art. Like, does it have to be this thing for every, like, I don't mean like, of course it's for other people, but like, it almost is like, you have to be like working for it's that issue of like state versus, you know, public versus private again.
Sure, yeah.
Like we're still.
But the conversation around the value of arts has become an increasingly shrinking arena, right? Even the New Hampshire State Council on the Arts used to have individual artist grants just for doing work. And now everything is connected to funding a public project or, so I do think those conversations about what art contributes to a culture, you know, need to happen in a more full, you know, with that perspective has to be kept, that art is a contribution in and of itself.
Sure.
Absolutely. But it's weird too, like as a poet sitting there being like, well, how can I cater my poetry to be like some public thing? Like, does it have to be changed to be some sort of three-dimensional like public thing? Like we don't know how to talk about what the value of poetry, which is more complex than our sort of like this almost like two-dimensional idea of like what art is sometimes.
So which brings me back, Bianca, to the whole question of, are these positions at first honors, or are they barely paid civil service positions, right? If it's an honor, then someone is chosen and there is some basic ritual of inauguration, and this person is gets to do the work that, you know, earned the appointment in the first place. Sure, you know, some public engagement would be good. Okay, here are 4 things we would like you to do, but with adequate support.
Yeah.
So that you're not, you know, so that the poet is not in the position of having a freelance gig. Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Right.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
so much work and it takes away from your writing, right? So it's like, yeah. And I hate that feeling of like you're just like begging people to understand poetry or something like this, like clawing your way to like change humanity. It's like so overwhelming. But I feel like poets don't want nothing less, you know, like change the hearts of men.
Right.
But
But it would be
have
good
like
though.
we don't
But
have
it
an
would, yeah,
infrastructure. Yeah, our society doesn't.
right.
You know, we're up against society and like really deep systemic issues of like American culture, and it's just like,
Sure, sure. But I think it would be great if the entities that, for want of a better expression, supervise these positions, if there was a basic understanding that one of the things they can do is to actively facilitate, to actively make connections, so that some, you know, the many ideas that we have some kind of infrastructural support. Otherwise, for, let's say, for example, somebody would like to give 4 lectures a year in the state. Who's making the calls for to the venues? Who's handling, publicity for the event, right? That kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing, that's what I'm talking about with, I think what I'm really coming down to is, for Massachusetts, as Massachusetts thinks about it, is to ensure that there's an element of dignity in the position. It's not about the money. I mean, no state poet position that I know of, maybe I may need to change states, comes with the kind of stipend that makes it about the money. It's not about the money. It's an honor. But I think something can be called an honor and still be short of dignity.
well, it's kind of funny to keep getting asked like what I do as a poet laureate, or like what a poet laureate is, or just, and the more I get asked it, the more I'm like, I wish I lived in a culture where we didn't have to ask that question. I feel like my mission is to like
Good.
try, it'll be 100 years if we even live that long, but like,
Mhm.
like what would it look like where if we knew what that meant,
Right.
that would be wonderful.
Yeah. But at the same time, all of us here are honored and grateful to be state poets, because there's also a level on which we know what it means.
Yeah, but here's the sweet, wonderful thing too, is like
Yeah.
the excitement in my little town, like everyone's so excited, and like even if they didn't know what it meant, they knew it was a big deal.
Yes.
And like people were like telling my husband at his work, like sending him emails. Like I feel like, it was so moving in that way. And
Right.
like the little local paper that's like $1, like does this front page article. I mean, I'm just like, oh, there's, I just felt so warm towards my
Yeah.
community in that way. So it's true that like even if people don't know, and right there, that right there is educational, because people are asking the question, and then you get to talk about it with them. And like I try to make it, we always have a good conversation about it until their eyes glaze over and they walk away.
I want to thank you all, and I'm really glad for this conversation that has extended. I think we're probably near the end of our time, but thank you for your such varied experiences and reflections, and of course your poems were wonderful. We will get this out onto YouTube, as I said, and publicize that link. I'm also saving the chat, so I'll be able to, at least for you folks, I'll be able to, that are participating. The chat link isn't going to be public, but I'll send it out to you so you can review people's comments and whatnot.
Thank you so much, David. You have done so much work to pull this together. So I just want to give you a shout out.
Well, you're most welcome, and but I'm so pleased to meet all these the New England Poets Laureate. I mean, I just so happy and to get to know you a little bit. It's been a great pleasure, and thanks again to everyone who attended.